Freilich and Chanukah, I want to first of all thank Dr. Yossi Simpson, who is sponsoring the Ilu Nishmas, his grandfather, Harav Eliyahu ben Harav Shimon Aaron, Rav Simpson, who was the Gabbai of the Rebbe Riatz. A lot of great yichus. It's wonderful to see multiple generations of Simpsons in the room as well. And Metz Hashem, he should be a Meilitz Yosher for you and the family always. Special Mazel Tov, just coming out of the Shor Brachos. Eli Surowitz is coming out of the Shor Brachos Sophia last evening. It should be a continued reason to come together, Metz Hashem, for continued smachos. We also want to wish a very special Mazel Tov to Mr. Mail, who is celebrating his granddaughter Daniela's wedding this afternoon, which is a huge Mazel Tov and a Metz Hashem. You should watch many of the grandchildren, many of the Eneklach get married and build their own mishpachos under your guidance, and you and Estelle for many Solanga Yaran and Metz Hashem together. And it's Mr. Mail's Hebrew birthday on the 6th day of Chanukah. Tomorrow, which is actually the time that the wedding's going to be, so Baruch Hashem, v'chein year will be gesund. So time just after Shkia is there we go, at the time of the wedding. So Metz Hashem, you should walk up to that chuppah on your birthday. Metz Hashem. Okay, so as we start, for those of you who've recently visited Prague, when you visit Prague in the Czech Republic, which is a beautiful country, actually an Israel-loving country, one of the few in Europe still left, and you go to visit Prague. Prague is a major tourist venue today, and when you visit the Jewish quarter, you have this uncanny feeling of Jews being a museum piece. All the shuls are museums, with the exception of the Altanai shul, and everything over there is commercial. It's all commercialized, and the restaurants and the shuls, everything is about what it was, and trying to make a few good dollars off it. And you have this uncomfortable feeling of walking through in front of, at the back of a group of tourists, all wearing cardboard yarmulkes, and talking about this ancient thing which used to be a Jew, and you want to scream out, "We're here still. We exist." In this, you actually pass in the Jewish quarter the statue you see on the right over here on the top of the page, which is a statue of the Maharal of Prague, Rav Yehuda Lau, who was the Maharal, very respected individual in his time, living in the 1500s. In fact, so much so that they even erected in the town square, they erected a statue of him. If you go to the graveyard, you'll notice there's on the left is his actual tomb, and on his tomb, it's hard to see in the picture for those who visited the cemetery, it's all full of coins. Right, everybody says, "Oh, this is a big rabbi." So everybody's like, okay, yeah, it's like, we'll put the coins on it. Maybe he'll help us. But it's a very unusual kind of graveyard to visit. Now, the interesting thing is if you were to ask your average tourist or your average Czech, what it is that was special about him, I think, for many Jews, we all say it was the Golam, right? And there's the Golam restaurant, and there's the Golam tour, and then there's the journalist who went up the stairs and never came down again, and are you going to be the next person? There's all the particular stories that surround the Maharal. When I was in high school, a particular Rebbe of mine who was an expert in Maharal said, it's a pity because his works are by far much more important than any rumors of Golams that ever were or could have been. And at the time it was kind of disappointing because, the Golam is a very exciting kind of story. But to be honest, the more we actually delve into his works, the more we appreciate just how magnificent he really was. Forget all the rumors and the protection and so on that he afforded the Jewish community. His works are remarkable. So, as it happens, he has an essay, which is a rather short essay for the Maharal, on Chanukah called Ner Mitzvah. And I know this is actually the example of it. This is not how long it is. Most of this is footnotes, introductions, and outros and epilogues. So this is the Rav Hartman edition. It's a very short essay in and of itself, and he covers a number of topics. What we're going to do today, this is the game plan, is to study a little bit of the Maharal on his own terms. And we're going to do simply 3 paragraphs. That's it. 3 paragraphs is the Maharal with a little bit of expansion. And the Maharal has a very, very interesting idea. which is about to set up, he sets up an idea which is, we'll call it a spiritual rereading of history. That's really essentially what he's doing. Meaning, we can look into ancient history and antiquities, and we can read about the Seleucid Greeks, and we can read about the Hashmonaic dynasty, and we can read about all those historical aspects of our history. We can read Josephus from now until tomorrow, and it's really a riveting read, believe me. But he's not going to be doing that. What he's going to be doing is saying there's a certain framework within which this history occurred. Let's try and understand that framework. I didn't have a chance to wish Mazel Tov to Dr. Honigman, who celebrated a beautiful bar mitzvah yesterday as well. Mitzvah Hashem, continued nachas. So here's how we're going to do it. Before we even get to the Maharal himself, let's take a quick tour into onto the second page. The framework that he's going to be working with, as simple as it may seem, is really essentially three circles. They are the Greeks, the temple, and the Kohen. If we think about it from that perspective, there are the Greeks which conquer the temple, and the Kohanim which reconquer the temple. Those are the three spheres that we're going to be working with, and we're going to have to really question each one of those. So, meaning to say, why was it that it was specifically that the saviors of the day were the Kohanim? Couldn't it have been anybody else? Was there nobody else who was passionate enough to lead the rebellion? So you say, well, those are the people who walked forward. They stepped forward at the right time. Okay, that's that. And if that's the answer, then okay, that's one way of looking at it. But I think that there might be more to that. So
they also were in shape. They ate a lot of meat, so they had strength.
I'm not going to disqualify the theory, so you're definitely a theory. But there might be something more to it.
There were no korbanos.
So there were no korbanos. Well, there were korbanos, just to be fair. When the temple was, there were various stages of Greek Hellenization, but there was a fellow called Jason who bought his way to the Kahuna Gedola, who was a Jew, and he started discus competitions in the actual confines of the temple, and he was involved with setting up a gymnasium under the Azara. So yes, it was still there was still korbanos going on, but it was we'll call it a more cosmopolitan kind of temple, if you know what I'm saying. So that's when you read the history. Are there any extras? If anybody could share, because I apologize. I only printed out 40 something. Thank you so much. Is that sure you're right? Yeah. Okay.
Now, if you go, Levi has a certain kainos. There's a message that says that Yehuda was the melech. Theoretically, he should have had the might and the foresight and leadership. But because doesn't desire to save Yosef, therefore he loses this privilege.
Interesting. So maybe it's something to do with their passion. We do see that Levi has a lot of passion, certainly when it comes to Shrem, earlier by Yosef, Pinchas. We do see that Levi certainly has the passion. That might be an aspect of it. We're actually not going to go in that track altogether, interestingly enough, but that is something which is historically pointed to. Now the question is on the other circle is why was it particularly the Greeks who were the antagonists? Now, historically speaking, we know that. We know why. Meaning to say they were the empire of the time. The Alexander the Great conquered the whole swath of land all the way down to Egypt. We know that. But the question is spiritually speaking, why was it that they were the antagonists and the protagonists were the Hashmonaim? Why oil? Why 8 days? All the basic questions. We know all the answers, but the question is maybe we can reframe all these answers. Why was it the Heichal that was particularly the point of contention between the Hellenists and the Hashmonaim? Remember, the word Hellenist includes many Jews. Okay, so the Jews were very much involved in this. So that's the starting point of this discussion. What we're going to do is something a little unintuitive, and that's what we're going to do is we're going to read section 2 first. Okay, we're going to read section 2 and section 3 first. Set up a interesting framework which we're more familiar with, and then delve into a unusual way of looking at reality. So what he's going to do is this is going to be based on numbers, meaning to say the way the Maharal views this is that there's a certain coding level which the Torah is conveying to us on a numeric level, meaning to say we try to communicate between let's say two individuals, we use words, we use expressions. So one aspect of communication is also the numeric coding that's between two individuals. So the Torah is conveying to us a certain framework within numbers. How does this work? Here's how he says it. Just before we read this, just as to bear in mind, what the Maharal, what some people call is proto-Chasidus, just to appreciate this. The Maharal came before there was any Chasidus. He delves a lot into the Kabbalistic notions of the Torah, but he couches them in basic philosophical terms. So this is mainstream machshava, but this became the stepping stool for further scholarship into the Kabbalistic aspects of the Torah. So this is where we're starting. He says the following, section 2. There was only sufficient oil to light for 1 day, but it lasted for 8 days. So far, so good. This is all basic knowledge that we're with. Why was it that the nace, the miracle, took place through the medium of light? It was because that the miracle was extracted from the Kodesh Kodashim, from the innermost sanctuary, an area in which the Greeks had no control. Somehow, whatever Greek power there was couldn't access inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. Why? What does that mean? Because that was the place where the Kohen Gadol himself had his purview. It was a place which was inaccessible. He could only enter there once a year by himself. No one else could enter. The or, apparently, the light, was emanating not from the menorah, but from inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. Okay? Interesting. What does that really mean? That's why it lasted 8 days. Because the Kodesh Kodashim is within the 8th dimension, beyond the 7. What does that mean? Meaning, like, how do we associate the inside of the Kodesh Kodashim with 8 as opposed to 7? Apparently, you see what's happening over here? The miracle lasts 8 days. The Holy of Holies is a sanctum in which 8 is prevalent above the 7. Outside of it, Greeks couldn't get inside of it. That's sort of the logic he's setting up over here. We don't understand the logic yet. Well, he's going to set up why. It says, "V'lama kodesh kadoshim achar shiva." Why is it that the innermost sanctuary is beyond the realm of 7? Ki hanhagas olam hateva hu tachas mispar shiva. We all know this idea. This is the Maharal. This is Maharillian thought. The world that we know, the world that we perceive around us, is constrained by 7. Is constrained within the realm of 7. This world is created within the scope of 7. There were 7 days of creation. If you want to add to this, by the way, that if you think about in terms of just sum total of directions, if you were to have a 3-dimensional axes, you have the X plane, the Y plane, and the Z plane, right? Those are essentially, if you move in either direction, the positive and negative direction on all those planes, you're talking about 6 directions. And then, of course, there is the framework which holds it all together. That's the 7th, which is essentially the 6 days of creation, right? There's different aspects of the creation, 6 parts of it, held together by the 7th, right? That's this world is that constraint. So therefore, he says, whenever you see something which is beyond the realm of this world, it is in the confines of 8. Achar Shiva Yemei Teva. It's after the 7 days of creation. Now that's just a very fascinating argument to make, because we know, first of all, in terms of the directions, there's 7, but in the 6th and the 1 holding it together, the 7th days of creation, the 6th and the 1. It's interesting, what other 7 did we have in the base of Mikdash? The menorah, right? The menorah of the times of the base of Mikdash was a 7-branched candelabra, the ones not like the ones that we use for our Chanukah. That's fascinating, which means to say, if you're thinking about what he's arguing, the Greeks could take control of the menorah. The Greeks did have power over the menorah because they had control over everything which was in the realm of 7. They couldn't access 8. Where was 8's sanctuary? The Holy of Holies. That's the way that he's looking at this over here. Just interesting point. They were matame, the oil of the regular menorah. It's somehow the 8-branched candelabra, which is more successful than the 7-branched one in this framework. Let's go a little further to what's really going on over here. So he moves on. That's stage number 1. Now he says, what are examples of 8? So if we think about 8 in our religion, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is bris milah. That's the first thing he talks about. Circumcision is above nature. Hashare, lefi hateva ha'adam nolad arel. A male human being is born uncircumcised. That is the natural state of being. V'zeh mipnei ki hateva noisein sheyeh arel. Meaning to say, nature prescribes uncircumcised, prescribes the foreskin. That's why the milah is on the 8th day of the child's, of a young male's life. Interestingly enough, if you think about this goes back to a conversation that was had between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus. Turnus Rufus was, or Tinius Rufus, as they say academically, was a Roman procurator at the time. Now, Rabbi Akiva had an interesting relationship because you have many conversations between him and the Romans, but in the end they killed him. Right, so it didn't end very happy. He was one of the 10 martyrs. In this conversation, which is recorded in the Midrash Tanchuma at the beginning of Parshas Tazria, where it talks about bris milah, in this conversation, so Tinius Rufus asks him and says, what are better, God's actions or human actions? Now, as a religious person, you would naturally say, well, of course, God's actions, right? God created everything perfectly. So Rabbi Akiva unintuitively answered, well, actually, human actions. And he said, well, why do you say that? So he says, well, I know what you're about to ask me. You're about to ask me about bris milah. If you think that God's actions are so perfect, why is it that you take God's actions and you mutilate them? You have a perfect baby, and the baby comes out of the womb. 8 days later, we're going to make a little adjustment, God. We'll call it human plus. So why do you do that? And by the way, this is very much within Greek methodology, Greek thought. Greek thought was very much put on a pedestal the human form, the beauty of the human form, which is why at the times of the Greeks, before the Romans even, which the people, one of the things that the Hellenized Jews would do would be to try to reverse the procedure of milah. Fascinatingly enough, meaning to say that the notion of the perfect or deformed human being. This was the question they had. Interestingly enough, when it comes to milah, what the Rabbi Akiva was saying is, he says to Tinius Rufus, the continuation of the conversation, what's better, bread or wheat? Of course bread, because God gave the world to us to process, to develop, to bring to sophisticated levels that we can use. God created the world 95% perfect. The other 5% He gave to humans. We take it a little too far sometimes, right? We have to reverse our destruction. But nonetheless, in certain cases, what God is saying is, I want you to be the one who's going to take it to the next level. But that level is not natural. It's beyond natural. That's what the 8 is over here. And this is why the Greeks were very upset about this. That's why the Hellenized Jews also, in a certain sense, felt uncomfortable. Because remember, the Greeks in their gymnasium would have large statues of naked human beings, and they felt uncomfortable being circumcised as the males, because they felt deformed. What the Maharal is saying is, no, that's exactly the access point the Greeks couldn't get. The 8 beyond the 7. Now, he goes on one more level. He says, shekol davar, in the third line, or the second line of the top of page 2. Shekol davar shu kodesh, nivdal min hateva shu gashmis chamris. Everything that is separate from the material world. That's why lakach kodesh hakodoshim shu nivdal lagamrei gamkein hu achar hateva. That's why the Holy of Holies is beyond nature. He hasn't explained that 100% yet, so we need to get a little more depth on that. Let's just reverse for the framework right now. We have the dimension of 7, which is the natural world. Everything outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim is in the realm of 7. The Greeks had control of that. They didn't have control of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, from which emanates the Nes of Chanukah, which is in the realm of 8, which relates to the bris milah. That's what he's set up till now. Now he's going to explain why the Kodesh HaKadoshim is 8. So this relates to the Kohanim in the room. He said the following in section 3, and then we're going to get to the end of section 3 and then think a little bit more broadly about what this argument is saying. This is hinted in the Midrash in Vayikra, which says the following: Bezois yavoi Aaron el HaKodesh. With this, Aaron shall enter the Holy of Holies. Remember, Aaron HaKohen only had 1 day of access to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and he had to come in. This is a very dangerous procedure, that he brought in the incense and the whole avodah on Yom Kippur, that 1 day that he came in, he needed to come with this. And nobody explains exactly what the this is. That's very important, right? Because at this point in time, it's he's walking a very thin tightrope of life. So he needs to come in with this. What's the this? The Midrash has a few examples. The Midrash says, Nichlas Aaron HaKodesh, but what that means is, Ki lo haya ra'ui ben adam chomri lichnos el makom shu kodesh kadashim, nivdal min agashmi hachamri im lo sheyesh ba'adam hamilah shu al hateva gamkein. What it means to say is that an ordinary, regular, physical human being cannot enter into the next realm, cannot enter into a realm which is essentially straddles spiritual, metaphysical, and physical in a physical state. So Aaron HaKohen had no access. He couldn't access that next realm as a regular human being, barring if he had bris milah. Meaning to say, if he was a human being who had been altered, had been shifted into a state of supernatural, into beyond natural, then he was able to access the beyond natural state, which is the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's why the Midrash says, what's Bezois Yavor Aaron HaKodesh? Bezois means with the bris, with the milah. That was his only ticket in. Which allows him access into this realm. Which, by the way, is fascinating, because what he's saying is that that small area in that in the Kodesh HaKodashim wasn't necessarily just a physical space. It was a metaphysical space. And we see, by the way, that there's certain things which reflect that. As an example, the Gemara in Bava Basra, Daf Tzadi Tesam Aleph says that if you do the measurements that are given in Tanakh of the Kodesh HaKodashim with the Aron in it, you find an interesting thing, that there is that the space on the Aron on the one side and the space on the Aron on the other side of it add up to the sum total of the width of the room. Now that's generally a problem, because for those of us who try to put furniture in the room, we wish that it worked that way, right? But it doesn't work that way, because usually if you have an item, let's say I have a grand piano, and I need to measure the width of the piano, and I need to find space in the room that's going to be taken up. But apparently with the Aron, you measure it from the one side to its side, the one side of the room to its side, the other side of the room to its side, and apparently those two widths added up to the entire width of the room. Which meant, what the Gemara's conclusion is, the Aron eino min hamida. The Aron is not measured, which means to say, in a certain sense, the rules of existence don't work the same there as they do anywhere else in the world. The dimension is not 7. It's not within the constraints of the physics. So how could a human being access that domain? Only when he himself has some mark that he is beyond the physics. That's what the Aaron is entering into. So that's what we're being told over here. Fascinating thought process. For those who recently there was a trying to remember what the name of it was. There's a name of a movie which came out recently about time travel, and about just very fascinating about entering into the realm of aliens, into extraterrestrial life, and they enter into the spaceship, and the domains shift. Like gravity shifts sideways, and the realm of communication is beyond time. It's just you say lahavdil. Just to give a sense of what it really means to be beyond the realm of here. Very interesting. I think it is. I don't remember the name. Arrival. Exactly. Thank you. So when you say when you enter into a different domain, there's the rules shift. The rules have shifted over here, and you can only access in this particular way. That's why now he adds one extra cherry over here, which is in the fifth line of the section 3. He says that's why it is that the Aron, the ark, which contained the Torah itself is beyond that which is physical. Nitna gam kein achar shiva. Of course, the Torah pervades the realm of 7 because it was given after 7. How do we know that? Sharek Siv. We know Shiva Shavuos Tispar Lach, that it was after 7 weeks. V'achar Shiva Shavuos b'yam ha'chamishim nitna ha'Torah. Isn't that interesting? The Torah was only given after we managed to get through the realm of 7 times. That's when the Torah was given to us, because the Torah really doesn't belong in the constraints of this physical world. V'chein ha'mizmor ashrei tzmimei derech. He quotes, this is just an interesting thing to notice. If you read the Telim Kuf Yotes, which is a very, very long mizmor, so after the first 7 psukim, then we reach the pasuk. Then it says Husar HaTorah. He doesn't quote it over here. He quotes it elsewhere that the 8th pasuk refers to the Torah, meaning to say once you get beyond 7, that's when you enter into the realm of Torah. Husar HaTorah v'hoilech b'tamnaya ape komosh bi'arnu lamala, and the Torah itself is divided into 8 faces. What that means to say is that there's 7 regular facets of the Torah, and there's an 8th facet which is beyond the realm of this world. Okay, so just to appreciate what the extra 2 steps that he's given us over here. Number 1 is that the Kodesh HaKodashim is a metaphysical realm which is not constrained by the physics, and therefore the Kohen can only access it with the ticket of Milah, which is his extra physical experience. And he enters into this realm, which is what's emanating, what can live in this place is we'll call it original Torah, the Torah which predated the world, this Aish Eish Shechora al Gabe Eish Levana, the white and black fires that the Ramban talks about, this primordial existence of Torah which exists in the ark. Now, this is where we get to the conclusion of this idea, and this is where everything matches. This is the overlap of the Venn diagram. Uvehechel atzmoi haya menorah uba shivaneros. In the external temple, we have a 7-branched candelabra. Aval b'kodesh hakadoshim, but in the internal temple, there's the level what's called kodesh, which is the regular holy, and then there's the kodesh kadoshim. In the innermost sanctuary, we have the kodesh kadoshim, haya Torah va'aron shi'or atzmoi, which was the place of the real light, not human-made light, but supernatural light. V'lakach nikra aron miloshen or. He says the reason why we call the aron, the ark, aron is not because it's a closet, as we use the word today, but it comes from the word or itself. It comes from light, which is in a certain sense very cerebral, very beyond the physics. Sha'Torah hi or v'hi shminis. It's the 8th level of it's the 8th in the octave. Umisham bohanes shel ches neros. And that's why the nes of Chanukah was derived from the innermost sanctuary. Kvar bi'arnu ki nishar pach echad katon shu munach b'chosmo shel kohen gadol. How did they get this? The only way they could light the menorah was they had to take the oil which was sealed with the Kohen Gadol's seal. V'yadua ki Kohen Gadol hu mishamish b'shmona begadim. The Kohen Gadol serves inside with the 8 clothes. The only time he could get in was with the 8 clothes of service. Which is a representation of him having access to the 8th realm. The reason why the candles could light for 8 days was because he could access that point that they couldn't reach, which was the innermost part.
He didn't wear those clothes when he went into the...
That's a great question. I'm not sure the answer to that. Because he actually only went down to the 4 garments before he entered in. Very good question. I'm not sure.
According to everything you're saying here, why did the Kohen go in on the 8th day?
Oh, excellent question. We'll see in a second. Great question. We're going to on the 8th day of Tishrei. Excellent question. We're going to see that in just a second. We're only at the beginning of this of his argument here. Excellent question. He goes on the 10th day. Why the 10th day? So here we go. Let's just appreciate what's going on over here. In this Venn diagram, we have the Greeks, we have the temple, we have the Kohen. Apparently, the temple itself is broken up into 2 levels. It sounds like the outer level of the temple is accessible via Greek culture. But the internal level of the temple cannot be accessed by Greek culture. Only the Kohen Gadol can access that. And that's why the resolution came from the innermost sanctum. The light which was derived from there was not natural, which is why that not natural light lasted for 8 days, representing that corner that the Greeks couldn't access. That's what ultimately what he said. And he's played it through the numbers, the coding of numbers of the 7 versus 8. Okay, so this is what he said at. Let's just try to appreciate this with 2 questions. Question number 1 is, why Greeks? Question number 2 is, why Kohanim? And then we can come back to where the Maharal looks at this. First of all, why Greeks? Who are the Greeks? So in Jewish history, interestingly enough, let's take a look at the very top of page 4. This section over here is a section of what's called the Seder Olam. Seder Olam is a lesser known midrash, which is of 32 chapters, and it is interestingly enough a history. Most of Rashi's time and dating goes back to the Seder Olam. You know, when Rashi says that Yitzhak was 37 years old at the Akedah, and then Rivka was 3 years old, all that comes from Seder Olam. That's the midrashic history line. There are those who debate it. Right? The Ibn Ezra doesn't always accept the Seder Olam, but Rashi's bedrock of dating is the Seder Olam, and most people don't know this. It's actually fascinating just to read through it. The Seder Olam goes all the way from creation till the very last line. This is the last chapter, or the last section in Seder Olam. He says the following. The end of the first line is talking about the rise of Greece. V'amad melech gibor, what's this referring to? Hu Alexandros Makdon. We're talking about this great king that Daniel talks about, who is Alexander the Macedonian, Alexander the Great. Shemalach Yud Beishana, who ruled for 12 years. Ad kan hayu hanaviim misnabeim beruach hakodesh mikan ve'elach hat oznecha ushma divrei chachamim. Till the point that Alexander the Great rose and the Greek Empire spread. The Greeks were there before. Until the Greek Empire spread across the Middle and Far East, there was Nevuah. Once Greece rose, Nevuah ceased to be, And the only way we could access God was Direi Chachamim, through wisdom. Isn't that interesting? Apparently, the only way we have access to what's divine is by thinking about it. This is one of the seismic shifts in all of world histories. If you were to divide up the world into different slices, this is one of the most important changes in history. Is before you wanted God, speak to the prophets. After that, speak to the sages. Do the sages have it clear? Not always. They try to think through to access where God is. It's a lot more murky. It's a lot more cloudier. We're talking at the age over here. What the Seder Olam is essentially doing is saying that Chagai Zechariah Malachi, while they're re-establishing the second Beis Mikdash in Israel, while that's happening, the Greeks are rising. As the Greeks are rising, the prophets end. As the prophets end, thought and wisdom now takes over, which is fascinating because the Greeks, of course, were the greatest philosophers of all time. Meaning, as we are turning to our sages, the Anshe Knesset Agdola, because that's all we have left, and as the prophets of the Anshe Knesset Agdola die out, then on the other hand, there's this rising bastion of philosophy in the world, which is through Greece. Now, interestingly enough, there are times where Greek philosophy, many times Greek philosophy, is in fact diverges from Torah thoughts. Right? The Greeks, in the numerous levels and numerous layers of philosophical thinking, diverged many times, because sometimes when you're thinking without a prophet, you end up at the wrong train station. Right? So what's interesting is if you follow through a number of the thoughts, as David will tell you, when you go through Moreh Nevuchim, you'll see the Rambam in many cases will extol the virtues of Aristotle and the Greeks, and many times he'll have to say, but ad kan v'lo yoter, that there are certain philosophies just don't work. And then there are people who are super commentaries on the Rambam saying, well, even what the Rambam accepted is too much of Greek philosophy. Just an example, and I want to work just as an example of this, with the framework used by the Ramban. Nachmanides. Nachmanides disagreed with the Rambam on a number of points. Here's how he quotes the Greeks. And I think his definition of Greek wisdom is very helpful to us here in trying to understand what's really going on over here. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, is actually quoted twice. He's quoted, one time he talks about this is in his writings on a ma'amar called Torah Hashem Tamim, which is to be found in the writings of the Ramban. And he says an interesting, he's quoting Aristotle, and he says the following. In source 4, he's talking about the creation of the world. Note that the Greeks, in general, many of the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, the head of them, believed that the world was kadmon, which means to say that the world always existed. There was never a starting point. You can imagine if the Rambam had been living in the year 1969 when they discovered, the radiation of the Big Bang, and that there was a starting point, you can imagine the Rambam jumping up from his desk and shouting "Eureka!" because all the philosophical proofs that he used were finally proven physically that there was a beginning point. The Greeks didn't believe that, right? So the Rambam, this is what the Ramban is saying over here in the second paragraph. He says, "Mikantira achzorius roish hafilosofim Aristoyomach shemai." There you can see now the cruelty. He doesn't call it the twistedness. He doesn't call it the intellectual dishonesty. He calls it the cruelty of Aristotle. Shu makchish kama dvarim shiro rabim v'ra'inu amitasam v'nisparsmu ba'olam. He says he would disagree with centuries of tradition of what everybody knew existed. If you were to go back a few generations and you say, was there Sinai? Was there creation? Everybody would say, of course there was, because we saw it. We were told by our parents and our parents' parents and our parents' parents' parents. And comes along Greek philosophy and says, well, if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. He says, Ki hachachmos ba'oisa hador hayakulam ruchanios. Wisdom in those days, in that age, was spiritual. It wasn't simply about what you told and what you could prove. Like the dark forces in the world. That wasn't something you put into a lab and measured, how many demons are escaping this test tube right now, right? That's not something you could measure. When people lived close to creation, they knew creation existed because they lived near that time. Adam told his children, Enosh, his grandchild, Enosh, I was created by God. Everybody knew that. There was nothing to talk about. Nobody would disagree with God. So what was their problem at the times of Adam and thereafterwards close to creation? Was serving those other powers. Those other powers are so proficient, so powerful. It wasn't about thinking, it was about misguided power. That's why they served Avodah Zarah. Im chidush shelo nachlu chachma kam ish hayodua aristoi v'lo hemin rak b'murgash v'chipes chachmas hamurgashos v'hikchish haruchanios. He said, comes along the Greeks and they say, the prophecy's ended. We no longer have this very powerful spiritual realm we're dealing with. If I can't measure it, it doesn't exist. I think, therefore I am. There's nothing that cannot be measured. A barometer, an altimeter, a thermometer, anything I can put a meter into exists. Anything outside of that, not for me. Right? So this is what the Ramban calls is achzarius. He calls this cruelty because ultimately you're denying a whole subterranean of existence, of spiritual existence, which everybody knew about. So the world didn't have a starting point. We can't prove that, right? So it must have just always existed. Now it's not that simple. But he has 4 books. Aristotle has 4 books on this. It's not like you just whip this out one day. But the point is, he says, look, we have to think about it. We have to measure it and hypothesize. And if there's no null hypothesis and it's not proven, then that's it. That it is as it is. Says the Ramban. That's where Greek culture missed it. His example of that, remember he talked about this notion of shadim, of like we'll call it darker spirits in the world. Interestingly enough, the Ramban refers back to this. This section of the Ramban, in fact, was taken out by the censor in his Pirush on the Torah, and in the later editions now we're able to find it. This is where the Ramban is talking about what happens on Yom Kippur. Of course, Yom Kippur seems to be this interesting day in the Chanukah discussion for some reason. On the Chanukah, on Yom Kippur, we have this very odd procedure. We know that we take 2 se'irim, and the one se'ir is sent as a korban, and the other one is sent to a place called Azazel. There was this valley, they threw the se'ir over Azazel. And the Ramban says, what is really going on over here? This is like very strange stuff, right? So we're not going to read the whole Ramban, but just listen to the way he sets this up. In source 6, he says, there's going to be one lottery to Azazel. Har gavoya tzuk kasher. It is a high mountain. Eretz gezerah lashon Rashi. Uvetoras kohanim la'azazel makom hakosher b'harim. Okay, it's a hard place. Skip to the next paragraph. What's the initials Reish Aleph stand for? He's quoting somebody. Rabbeinu, Rebbe Avraham. He's quoting the Ibn Ezra. So he quotes the Ibn Ezra. He unusually disagrees with the Ibn Ezra. Interestingly enough, he actually accepts the Ibn Ezra in this particular forum. Kosav Amar of Shmuel, Aval Pisha Kosav Sebeseir Achatos Shehu L'Shem, Gam Asir Mishtaleach Hu L'Shem. Shmuel in the Gemara says that both those Seirim went to God, even though it doesn't say that the one that goes to the cliff is to Hashem. Ve'ein Sorech, says the Ibn Ezra, you don't need to be that religious. I mean, you don't have to say that the second Seir went to God. Ki HaMishtaleach Einenu Korban. The one that was thrown over the edge of the cliff wasn't a Korban. Shelo Yishchat, it wasn't shechted, it died on the way down. V'im yacholto lahavin hasoid shu achar milas Azazel teda soidar v'soid shmoy. If you can understand the word after Azazel, then you will understand what it really means. Meaning to say, what the Ibn Ezra is saying is, there's something deeply Kabbalistic about the second goat. Well, of course, we always know in paganism today, the goat is a very substantial sign, right? Ki yesh lo chaverim b'mikra. There are other words related to this in the Torah. V'ani agaleh lecha ksas hasoid beremez b'yoscha ben 33 teda'enu. When you turn 33, I'll tell you what it means. It says the Ibn Ezra. Right? I mean to say, this is not for novices. That's what the Ibn Ezra is essentially saying. Says the Ramban, V'hinei Rabbeinu Avraham ne'eman ruach machas davar. V'ani harachil megaleh sodai. He says, he's obfuscating the ball. I'm going to reveal it to you, says the Ramban. Shekvar golo asa Rabbeinu b'makom Rabbim, because the rabbis talked about this. And the Ramban goes on to explain, it's worthwhile seeing inside. And again, this might be my misinterpretation, but this is what the Ramban says. The Ramban quotes numerous midrashim where there is a power, there's a dark force in the world which is to be found in the areas of Midbar. And Hashem is telling us, this is the one time where Hashem says, is that we are turning towards that force and giving that force something which is going to take the sins of Bnei Israel. It's crazy, crazy idea, because this sounds dramatically close to Avodah Zarah and Kishuv, where then the Ramban addresses that by saying, yeah, well, God told us this is the one time that we do it in this. At the end of this, don't sacrifice to the Seirim, these powers, only there's some dark stuff over here the Ramban's talking about. Now, I don't want to walk out over here thinking that Yom Kippur is Avodah Zarah, chas v'shalom. What the Ramban is saying is that there are dark forces in the world, and Hashem is telling us that the Averos, the negative energy generated by Averos, are in a certain sense related to that force. Right? And when we're cleansing the Averos, we go back to where those dark forces come from, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, is on top of all the dark forces, but nonetheless, we relate to that. And at the end of this paragraph, the Ramban then turns back to the Greeks. Because remember, we're talking about deeply spiritual stuff. The Ramban says at the very, very end, on the bottom of source, page 5. And that's why it says the end of this whole section of Yom Kippur is don't sacrifice to those Seirim. Don't sacrifice, don't on your own accord go and sacrifice that notion called Seir, these dark forces. There are many examples of this. He says it's very clear. Now, that's, according to the Ramban, it's very clear. To us, we're going to spend our lifetime trying to understand this. Unless you try to get into the spiritual exactitude of what a korban is. This is if you want to understand this, there's necromancy. Right, so it means they don't go into that domain. It's understood in the intellectual realm, and it's only understood by those who understand the depths. I'm not going to explain it. That doesn't mean to say I don't want to explain it. What that means to say is that there aren't sufficient words to explain that. Words limit this concept because it's too powerful for words. Now, he says the following. Because then we'd have to explain it in words to now explain away to those people who follow the Greek. Who's the Greek? Aristotle. Okay, Asher hikchish kol davar zulasi hamur gashloi, who said that nothing existed unless he could feel it. V'higis dartoi, and he became very arrogant. Lachshavhu v'talmidim harashayim, that he and his students, the evil students, kikol inyan shelo hisig elov hu b'svarasoi anenu emes, who believes that unless you can conceptualize it within your small, limited logical framework, it doesn't exist. So says the Ramban. This is an example where the Ramban is referring to the Greeks. The Greeks simply don't have access to the spiritual, the metaphysical domain. We start talking about anything metaphysical, they don't have access, because all they can access is what's in the constraints and the limits of human logic and the 5 senses which we are given. That's all they have. So now coming back to this for a moment. Where do the Greeks have access to? Apparently only the outer framework of temple. That's what the Ramaral is saying. They can only access that which is felt, that which is measured, that which is thought. Now, let's go a little further. Why the Kohanim? That was question 1. Why the Kohanim? Who are the Kohanim? Interestingly enough, the Gemara in Nedarim says, the Gemara asks a very famous question, which has halachic ramifications, and that is, are Kohanim our shlichim or God's shlichim? Are they the people serving in God's temple on their behalf, right, Mary? Or are they the people serving us, bringing our korbanos to God? Which one is it, right? Which way? Are they going up from us, or are they coming down from God, ultimately? Where are they? And the Gemara leaves it as a ambiguous question. Where are they? Are they coming up from us, or are they coming down from God? Which means to say that they might be the people who have the further access, like the Maharal was saying, into a realm beyond which the pedestrian, the proletariat has access to. An example of this, and this is famous on Tisha B'Av, and this is tragic. An example of what this means. Two cases. One of the kinos on Tisha B'Av is about the children of Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, the Kohen Gadol. Remember this? And his daughter and his son were sold into slavery, and the slave owner said, "Oh, what beautiful children! Let me breed them." And so he put them into the room together, and all night they spent crying that they, with the children of the Kohen Gadol, were being mated by this slave owner, and in the morning they saw that they were brother and sister, and they hugged each other and died weeping. That's the kinah. We have a kinah on this just after Arzei Levanon, or just before Arzei Levanon on Tisha B'Av, and that's what when Yirmiyahu says Al Ele Ani Bachia Ani Yardamayim, he's referring to these two children. Now, it's strange because all the other kinos are talking about massive national calamities. This one's about two children. Now, they could be exemplars of the greater tragedy, but in a certain sense it's strange. But then the Gemara goes on to the next story. This is the Gemara in Gittin. Take a look at the top of page 7. Now, that story we know more, we're more well versed with. The following story we're not as well versed with. Omeresh Lakish, Masa Isha Achas, but Sofnas Bas Peniel Shema. There was a young lady whose name was Sofnas Bas Peniel. Why? Tzofnas shall called Tzofim b'yofya. Tzofnas means because everybody would gaze at her beauty. Bas Peniel bito shall kohen gadol. Shishamash lifnai v'lifnim. She was called Peniel because internally, Penim, Ekel, the inside aspect of the God. Shishimish lifnai v'lifnim. She nis'ala boy shavai kol halayla. She was raped all night. Lemachar hilbisha shiva chalukim v'atzia lemachra. He, the slave owner at the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, brought her out to sail. Ba adam echad she'mechura b'yoser. A disgusting individual came over and said, Amar hirani as yafa. He says, unclothe her. Amar, the slave owner said, Reikoi mata roitzeli kach she'en ki yafya b'chol ha'olam kulai. And the slave owner said, he says, buy her or don't buy her. She's the most beautiful creature in the world. Amar loy. He says, no, sorry, I want to see my merchandise. He ripped off the 6 outer garments. She ripped the 7th garment and fell down to the dust. Amra lefonav, Ribono shel olam, im aleinu lo chasta al kedusha shemecha gibor lo mechatachos. You don't care about me, a human being. Don't you care about your name? V'alav kanan Yirmiyahu, and that's what Yirmiyahu cries about, this particular case. Bas ami chagri sak v'yispashli be'afar. My daughter, who's wearing sackcloth and rolling in the dust. That's what Yirmiyahu is talking about, is this girl. Again, do you see something interesting? It's about an individual tragedy. But it's not an individual tragedy. Did you notice something interesting? Both these stories are about the children of Kohanim Gedolim. Isn't it interesting that when the slave traders move in, all they can see is physical beauty? Do you see what's happening here? Let's breed them. That's what's happening. The world walks in and I see the Kohanim and I say, wow, isn't that beautiful? Can't we breed them? Remember the face of Rabbi Yishmael that the daughter of wanted to take off, and they stripped off his face, the skin of his face, to make a mask so she could keep it? He's so beautiful. Because when you live in the realm of what you can see and what you can feel, all you can see when you see the sublime spiritual beauty is the physical remains of it. Give me the face. Give me the daughter. Let me breed them. Do you see what the Gemara is talking about here? The tragedy is when a physical, gross human being looks at spiritual beauty, all they can see is the physical beauty. That's all they can have access to. That's the tragedy of these two stories over here. It's not the tragedy of individuals. It's the tragedy of the loss of a world in which you could see something special anymore. That's what's happening in this Gemara. That's who the Kohanim were, and that's what the Greeks missed. Let's come back now to a full circle. We're not going to do this inside, but this is really worthwhile to see in the Maharal himself. And I'll leave it to you in the first section for your own edification as it gets further. But let's take a look at this. If you just flip to the last page for just a second. Now the Maharal enters into we'll call it the superstructure of numbers. Let's take a look at the word heichal. The word heichal is in fact, if you look at the gematria of it, it's a 5, it's a 10, it's a 20, and a 30. That gives us 65, right? So heichal is 65. 5, 10, 15, right? 20 and 30 is another 50, so that's 65. What's Yavon? Yavon is 10, 6, and 50, which is 66. Which means, can the Greeks control the sanctuary? The answer is yes. They are one notch above Heichal. The Greeks, Yavon is one notch above Heichal. You give them a beautiful edifice. You give them the daughter of a Kohen Gadol. Can they control it? Yes. They can even destroy it. They can even look at it and say, pretty, pretty. And then they can make whatever they feel out of it. That's what they're going to do to it. But, then we have the people who resolve this, and now the Kohanim. What's the gematria of Kohen? 75. 25 and 50. Isn't it interesting that it's 75? Because remember, the Kohen Gadol is the person who is the bridge character between our domain and God's domain. Is he shluchei didan or shluchei derachmana? Is he the bridge between us or God? 75 is the merger between the 7s and the 8s, right? He's the mid-range person who's able to access into the realm beyond the physical. So he's the only person who's able to access into the domain beyond God, which is the realm of 8, which is in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But let's think about this more carefully. Look at the word Heichal very carefully now. Let's come back to this. This is what the Maharal says. The word Heichal, if you actually spell it out, has got a tseirei under the Hey, which means there's actually a hidden letter in the word Heichal. If you really spell it out, malay, which means to say full, with all its pronunciation, it's actually spelled Hey, Yud, Chaf, Lamed. There's a hidden Yud that is attached to the Tzeireh, which means, what is the actual numeric value of Heichal? It is 75, which means that the temple of God is divided into 2 strata. There's the external strata. There's the beautiful, magnificent edifice that the Greeks walk into and place their flags and stamp their boots on. And that's what they can control. And they can control the cabinet and candelabra. And they can make it a gymnasium. And they can do what they want with it. But you know what? There's one domain they simply have no access to. And that's the internal domain. That's in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, where they simply can't see. They simply can't access because it is beyond the realm of human thought. It is beyond measuring tapes. It is beyond any meters. It's beyond conception. That's the realm which only the Kohen Gadol can access on one day with his supernatural experience, which is his bris milah, bezois yavo Aaron ala kodesh. Says the Maharal, just to give you an example of this, Lahavdil. You know, Arturo Toscanini was a famous conductor, the last generation, and he was getting very frustrated with a particular violinist, and the violinist the man just wasn't getting it. So he says, "Well, what am I supposed to do, Mr. Conductor?" So he pulls out, in frustration, he pulls out a tissue and he says, "You're missing it. It's like this," and he lets the tissue, the handkerchief, wave to the ground slowly. That's what you're missing. Meaning the man was reading the notes. The man was doing everything that was on the sheet music. He was listening to the conductor intently. But what was he missing? He was missing the spirit of the music. He was missing what's really behind. You can't teach that. It's like bike riding, right? Once you get it, you get it. Once you don't have it, no matter how many books you read on it, you're not going to get it, right? That's what's happening over here. The Greeks thought they had it, but they had only so much access. That's what the Maharal says. That's why it is that the miracle of Chanukah emanated from the realm beyond control. And that's why it was 8 days. That's why the miracle, it wasn't just because, practically speaking, we needed to get there, it took 7 days, so for Torah, that's true too. But the fact is that this miracle lasted beyond where anybody else could control. When we look at those candles in the night of Chanukah, we're not just looking at combustion and oxygen in the air and everything else happening. That's true too. What we're looking beyond, and we're saying, there still is beauty in this world. And there's a beauty in this world which cannot be captured in a picture, in a tag, on Facebook. There's something much beyond anything we ever see. And that's the realm of Kedusha. That's the Lifnai v'Lifnim, which we celebrate even beyond the Beis HaMikdash itself. Have a Chanukah Sameach.